Hi, Misha here, and this is one I previewed on my personal channel, Misha. The new imports by Guns of Chinese military surplus Type 54 Tokarevs, chambered for 7.62 by 25 TT to a Tokarev. And these are pretty darn neat, for a few reasons. We have had Chinese Tokarevs in the country, at least we did up until 94 back in the day. We had the 7.62 version as the Type 54-1, and we had the 9mm version as the M213, or Model 213. And we even had some that were sold with conversion kits and barrels and some other variations and what have you. But all of those had to have safeties, because the 1968 Gun Control Act had many provisions, and one of them basically said that guns had to have points, and having a safety was a big point thing, and anyway, yada yada, you can read on it. So the guns brought in the 80s and 90s had safeties added. Now this is actually not Chinese, this is Russian, but same era, same import style. And they usually put a safety in the back here. There's a few different styles. Cosmetically, not the worst thing ever, but it did require that a hole be drilled in the frame, plus a notch for the safety to be in. And some of them have little screws for stops. In more recent times, guns have come in like this. This is a Romanian TTC, which is the Cougar Tokarev. This one's imported by M+M, but even the ones brought over by Century, they have this very big safety here. Again, requiring a hole in the frame to block the trigger. These were still nice when they first started coming in 15 some odd years ago, because we had not seen many surplus Tokarevs. Most of the ones we had were commercial ones from China, with a few military ones from Russia. So we kind of accepted it. There were a few other styles too we'll talk about. But yeah, in fact, when they first started importing these in the very beginning, they did not even want to make them CNR eligible, because they considered that as a modification. But they worked with the law and were able to import them even with the doofy safety as CNR. So that's good. And we've had others come in since then. But more recently, the last couple of years, this style of safety is being added. There's no hole drilled in the frame, no cutout in the slide. Instead, the trigger itself has a Glock style dingus or tit on it to pivot it, so you can't pull the trigger unless that's pulled in. Now, the original Tokarev really didn't have a safety. The only thing it had was half-cock, which does pretty much lock up the action. That's because Fyodor Tokarev's idea was, by not having a manual safety, they could simplify and streamline mass production, which was very important. And his thought was, well, with good training of the soldiers, and these are meant to be issued to officers anyway, manual safety is not really necessary. And if you think about it, they were coming from the 1895 Nagant revolver, and as with most revolvers, it didn't have a safety either. So yeah, it's a problem for import. Even today, the 1968 Gun Control Act requires them, but finally we found a way to satisfy the letter of the law and not drill holes in our frickin' pistols. And with these R-gun imports, they're still considered CNR too. For example, this one is dated 1959. Others are in the 60s, 70s, and even 80s. Most are factory 66, with the Xinjiang. But there are a few other codes in there. So before we talk more on the history of the Tokarev and these, let's go to the range and run some rounds through these. Now, full disclosure, the only Tokarev ammo we had was PPU hollow point. So, this should be interesting. Type 54 Tokarev. Needs hollow points. Let's try another mag. Alrighty. These really are fun guns, and surprisingly doing alright with the hollow points. So if the older guns, if you got them, and you wanted to pull the safety off one like this, you can pull it off, but the frame is pretty well messed up behind. One like this, with the safety behind the trigger, you can just remove it, like on my Polish here. It does leave a hole behind it, which a gunsmith with skill can plug up. I just haven't done it yet on this Polish one, but it doesn't affect function, thank goodness. And that was really the best we had. But it is perfectly legal to remove the safeties. We're not violating anything by doing that after these are imported and sold privately. Just like how a lot of Makarovs come with those target grips, and then you can install standard military grips after you take it home. With the Tokarev, the Chinese Type 54 here, is the same way. Which means it's a very simple process. So, to get rid of the trigger dingus here, it couldn't be simpler. Here's the gun we were actually shooting, with the standard unmolested trigger in it. Here it is, out of it. Comes right out. You don't even have to fully disassemble the gun. Here's a frame. This is from a commercial Type 54-1. See the safety here I was talking about. You don't have to take the top of the slide off at all. You just have to remove the grips. And Tokarev grips are quite interesting because they're not held on with screws. There's just this lever here. You can use a cleaning rod or other thing to rotate it. You just stick it up in the magwell to take the panel off. Once you take both panels off, you can pull your trigger back. It'll come back. It'll hit this pressure against the spring. You can tilt it down, and then it just slides right out. And then you can put in a normal trigger, and you are good to go. And with the, understanding that there could be minor fitting, generally speaking, other Tokarev triggers, Russian, Polish, Romanian, should all fit the Chinese gun, because the Type 54 is just a copy of the late Russian style. Of course, in Russia, the Tokarev was first tried out and adopted as the TT-30 with the first pre-production batch in 1931, and then between 1934 and 36 they would make a few design changes just to streamline it for mass production. This would become the TT-33, produced throughout World War II in Russia, and until 1954, until after the Korean War was over. And they would build about 1,700,000 in Russia. But they would also, of course, export the design to friendly nations. Including Poland, it was known as the WZ-33. In Hungary, it was the 48M. In Romania, it was the TTC. And in China, it was first the Type 51, which was a version assembled in China, but using Russian parts. And then they would gradually start making more and more parts domestically in China. And when they finally transitioned over all the way to Chinese parts, it was redesignated as the Type 54. Now, it's not 100% sure if any were put into full mass standard production in 1954. We do know that some Type 51s were still being made in 1954. But either way, about 1955, an all-Chinese Tokarev was being produced. And most of them do come from Factory 66 here. But this one has an interesting code of 636, which is actually a factory known for making diesel engines. So I have this kind of humorous thought in my head where they had this engine factory and they noticed they had a few thousand square feet left over in one corner, and China being China, say, what can we do with it? Then let's make pistols. So they were made by multiple factories in China. And of course, early on, they mostly went to the Chinese People's Liberation Army, as well as some being used by the Navy and Air Force. But by the 1970s, they had enough of what they need. They also had their own Makarov, which is the Type 59, which we do have a video on. And so these were primarily made for export, and they were exported to many places, including Vietnam. In the past, it was stated that Chinese Tokarev production ended in the early 70s, but with these new imports from our guns, like this one here, we see some pretty late dates, well into the 80s, including 1985. So in the ones I received, and this is just mine, the earliest was 1959, and the latest was 1985. Some will have the standard 4-digit year on them. Others, you have to determine the year based on the serial, which admittedly is not foolproof because while they did usually follow a formula, there's always exceptions, always things that break the rules. So, yeah, let's fire a few more rounds through this because Tokarevs are fun. Type 54. Now Jay is going to give the Chinese a try.
I wanted to say really quickly, if you have not shot a Tokarev, you need to. If you don't own one, you should try to get one because they are insanely fun. They have a really concussive boom that's not loud. It just, you can kind of feel the thump of it. It's very bassy. And the recoil is very present once you know you're shooting a full caliber, but the recoil is very springy. It's not uncomfortable at all. So these are incredibly fun.
Yeah, it's not snappy. It's
exactly.
What it is it's really spread out, so it doesn't ever snap the web of your hand.
Right.
Unlike a VZ52, which I do not like shooting.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm definitely not the biggest fan of shooting this gun. And I did it quite a bit 20 years ago. At that time, the surplus Tokarevs were few and far between, and even the Chinese commercial ones didn't pop up. But these Czech VZ52s were available, and I really wanted something in the Tokarev caliber, so I did pick this one up way back then. And so it was really my first exposure to really shooting the cartridge. But then, a couple years later, I got a commercial Type 54-1, and I couldn't believe how much more comfortable and fun it was to shoot. So, this gun quickly got retired. Why do I still have it? Well, it has been with me a very long time. And at that time, you could get these in the store with magazine and holster, 2 magazines and holster, for like $50. And I had bought this one for myself on my birthday and figured it's worth keeping for that. I think it's mechanically interesting. This is a roller delayed gun, whereas the Tokarev uses a modified, simplified Browning tilting or tipping barrel system, and that's really why this has a very spread out and gentle recoil. This one, because of the agitation from the rollers, is kind of harsh and sharp and straight back on you without much flip up. It's just right back into your wrist. Another thing, the grip angle. This has a very wide grip front to back, and it's kind of trapezoidal shaped, which ergonomically does not fit me the greatest. Whereas the Tokarev, while the grip seems like it would be uncomfortable, it's shockingly quite nice. It's relatively small, with a very square but decently ergonomic grip, and I like its trigger style more. It's a straight back trigger, 1911 style, whereas this is more of a pivot trigger, and I always manage to pinch my finger a bit with this trigger, like on the bottom. It's very close, but it still has a gap as you pull it back on the trigger guard. So yeah, I really prefer the Tokarev, any of them, over the VZ52. And to be fair, even the Czechs were not super satisfied with this gun. To their credit, it was originally designed for 9mm, not Tokarev. It was rechambered for 7.62 Tokarev to meet Warsaw Pact standards. So it's not entirely the gun's fault. But yeah, if this is the only Tokarev caliber gun you've ever fired, you really need to give a TT33 style a try. Okay, enough with the sidetrack. Let's get back to it. So this was the second major batch of guns to come in with the Dingus trigger. The first, of course, was the batch of Yugoslavian Zastava M57s. Back in the day, before any of these were imported, this was kind of a one I really wanted, because like most Yugo or Zastava items, it is very closely patterned on the Russian design, but has its own kind of flair. In fact, when Jay was shooting the Chinese, he said, "Is this standard size?" Yeah. The reason he thought so is he owns one of the Yugos, which has the larger, longer grip and larger mag catch. These all have about a 4.6 inch barrel and are about 7.6 inches long and weigh about 31-32 ounces. But the Yugo is just a little bit taller, and actually it would weigh just a few ounces more. Unfortunately, that means Yugo mags have to be their own. They can't use other nations, although their mags will typically fit in other Tokarevs. And these are pretty standardized. I've seen a few people say that guns like the Romanian here take their own mags, but I've never found that to be the case. I can swap them between my guns. However, some guns are made differently, and with all the years of production and different specs, and of course Soviet tolerances were always pretty loose, it's definitely possible to have a gun that may be a little pickier. One neat feature about the Tokarev is that the magazine does not have feed lips. Rather, the feed lips are built in to the removable hammer trigger assembly in the back, so there's very little chance they're going to get damaged. This made magazines both cheaper and easier to produce, It also meant that they would last a lot longer and endure a lot more abuse. Always nice. And that was kind of the name of the game behind the Tokarev in general, was inexpensive but reliable. And of course the 7.62x25 cartridge was powerful. Based on the 7.63 Mauser used in the broom handle, the C96, it's basically the same round but upcharged quite a bit. And the Russians really liked that round, and it was definitely good at range and punching through light armor. Also ended up being quite a good submachine gun round in things like the PPSH-41, the Papasha, and the PPS-43, the Sudiev. And when you're shooting it in low light, it makes some pretty neat fireballs, which we just so happen to have. Take a look. Let's end with the Type 54 with some fireballs at dusk. Okay. What it's doing on these hollow points, once in a while it'll catch, but we've had very few problems, all things considered, today.
Yep. Good there.
Once in a blue moon, the edge of the hollow point will catch on the feed, but not bad for a gun that was never designed for HP. So, it was a fun gun, and plenty reliable. There were a few minor hitches, as you saw and heard us talking about, where the hollow point, the sharp edge of the hollow point, would kind of hang up on the rim there, but it was very easy to feed. You could just either tap it forward, or at most just pull the slide back a bit and let it go. So not really going to blame the gun, since this design was made well before hollow points were a common thing, and again it mostly worked just fine. And these seem to be in good condition. Some of them seem to have been re-arsenaled, re-blued, but they're coming in with good finish, at least matching slide and frame. I did notice some have original military mags, and others look to have either late production military mags or more modern aftermarket replacements, which makes sense. I'm sure if they got these and they came in with a bad mag, they had to do something. And I hope the Dingus trigger continues. After the 57s came in, this batch came in from M+M, still having the old school safety. So it seems like the word hasn't gotten out to everyone yet. But I hope it does, because this is the way to import Tokarevs. Great guns too, just for history and whatnot. Powerful, simple, reliable. One fun fact about their construction: there's not a single screw in this gun. It uses mostly split pins. Tokarev, he designed these to be made with pretty basic machines and lathes available in early 1930s Russia. Wartime guns will have wood grips, but most you see will have black Bakelite style with the star on them. This is why the Chinese guns were kind of colloquially known as black star guns, and it's often reported that a lot of these were smuggled into Japan to be used by the Yakuza. And today they definitely made their way throughout Asia and really the rest of the world, because much like with the SKS, China produced a lot of these, and for decades. As to where these come from, it's sad to report that the prohibition the ban on importing importing rifled barreled guns from China has not been lifted as of 2020. We can still have smooth bores out of China, which is why we have shotguns like their Sega clones. But rifled pistols and long arms were banned in April of 1994, or rather, China was sanctioned. So these come in, much like SKSs from originally from China, have been coming in the last few years from a third-party nation. I'm not going to say which one because there's been several speculations. There's not been a for sure confirmed thing yet. But if a firearm is in a third-party nation for 20 years or more, it can be imported and the country of origin can be put down as that country. So, if, for example, they were sent to Austria or Canada in 1995, they could be legitimately imported into the USA as Austrian or Canadian after 2015. So it's using such technicalities that lets us have Chinese guns, but not directly out of China. And I'm hoping we'll see some other Chinese pistols, like maybe military type 59s, or maybe even some other rifles like we've seen with the SKS. That would be pretty neat, because obviously when the American market was cut off from China in '94, they had tons of guns either built or in the process of being built in the pipeline that had to be diverted elsewhere. So now those guns have been out there for 25 years in some cases and can finally come into the US legally. So I hope importers continue to be smart. One other thing I'll mention before I go, I really like where these newer guns are putting import markings. They're not huge billboards like Century would do. Like this one here is very small on the underside of the trigger guard. The M+M is very small as well on the underside of the slide under the barrel there. Now keep in mind the ATF does specify a minimum size font they can use, so no microscopic allowed. And these R guns are likewise in the same place under the barrel. Perfectly acceptable in my humble opinion. Would no import mark be preferred? Of course. But if I had a choice between no safety or no import mark, give me no safety any day of the week. But yeah, we had fun at the range with this, and Tokarevs are cool. If you don't own one, you should definitely pick one up. The Chinese here are selling a little bit higher than typical for imports at about $350, but then again, how many military type 54s are in America? Some other guns, like the Romanians, have historically been a little cheaper at $200 to $250, and the Yugos are about the same, maybe a little higher in the $250 to verging on $300 range. Also keep in mind with the M57s, there are the surplus guns like these. There are the other imports that have a 1911 style safety back here that's been added after the fact, and they're still military. Both of those will be CNR. And then there are the modern production M57As that are made by Zastava in Serbia, and these will have a factory installed safety on the slide. Now those safeties aren't bad because at least they're put in at the factory. Final warning. If you are buying a surplus Tokarev with an added safety, any of these styles, this style here, This one up here on the Russian. Do not trust this safety. They literally make the guns less safe. Do not use them. Do not trust them. Use your head. And these still do have Tokarev's original safety, the half-cock, if you need to. But do not trust these added safeties because they can be janky, they can break, and I've even heard of instances, typically with this Romanian style here, that also appears on some Polish, of literally, you know, having the safety on, pulling the trigger, taking the safety off, and the gun going off. Welcome to government bureaucracy. Yeah. But yeah, I thought it was a neat gun. There's not a lot out there on these. There's not a lot of history on the Type 54, aside from it exists, and it is a copy of a late Russian TT-33 made in China for decades, and exported legally and otherwise around the world, which is still pretty cool. And I picked this one up just to kind of complete my Tokarev collection, at least until I can score a Type 68 from North Korea. I have had a couple of Hungarian 48Ms, but the money was too good, so I moved them along. Those have not been imported en masse yet, so hopefully one day we'll see some Hungarians, and hopefully they'll come in with the Dingus. Anywho, if you purchased one of these R-guns, what did you think? How did yours look? What date did you get? What factory? Are you happy with it? If you have any questions or comments, please do post them. And as always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel so Jay and I can get out to the range, please check on our Patreon page for tiers, rewards, and all that good stuff. With that, this is Misha, and we will both catch you very soon next time.